Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Object Class 001 Proposals, the show where your hosts, A Random Day,
and Captain Kirby.
argue at each other and call it a podcast. On tonight's episode, 001 Proposals, running the gamut from sub 300 word flash fiction to full blown novels with over a dozen chapters. Each proposal is an event that rocks the site and threatens to shape lore as we know it. So, what does that actually mean when you want to write a 001 proposal? Let's find out. Thankfully, Captain Kirby is an expert on the subject, writer of Kirby's Proposal 0513. Kirby, to start off with, what do you think makes an SCP article worthy of being an 001? What do you think they have in common, besides the naming convention, I mean?
So, aside from just being a very strong and interesting story on its own right, because if you don't have that, then you just don't have an interesting article. Aside from that, I find that most 001 proposals that stick out and really feel like they bring meaning to that slot have something to say. Either something to say about the Foundation lore, something to say about the format, or something to say that's a little bit more meta, but at least in my opinion, the best 001 proposals and the ones that really make that slot kind of shine have something new to say about the site. I should make a lot more emphasis on the word new because you can rehash a lot of old ideas in SCPs and give them new flavors, but a lot of best 001 proposals bring something brand new to the site as a whole that you haven't normally seen prior.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make. A lot of the most memorable 001 proposals are like Bright's 001 proposal or Pedantic's 001 proposal or Andrew Swan's 001 proposal or Tufto's proposal to Scarlet King. Articles that not just revisit but reinterpret site lore in a major way. One of the things that this reinterpretation of site lore lends itself to an 001 proposal is a sense of, I think, scale and stakes, because the reader's already invested in whatever subject you're tackling if it's some already explored aspect of site lore that you're trying to interpret from the lens of an 001 proposal. For example, 05-13, which is basically a targeted examination of who is the Overseer Council as a faction in site lore, how many individuals are they, and who are they as characters. Kirby, do you want to take us through what you were thinking about when you conceptualized 0513 under that lens of reinterpreting site lore?
Yeah, I remember when I first started thinking about this, I kind of knew that I wanted to at some point write an 001 proposal. So as I came up with ideas for SCPs, I kind of had that in the back of my head if I ever thought I came across an idea that would fit. And when I thought of the idea of SCP-001 is 05-13, I kind of ran with it from there. And one thing that was kind of at that point well established was the idea that the O5 Council is this shadowy group of effectively evil characters in a lot of interpretations, that they are these supernatural, larger than life entities. Some of them have magical powers, or they just have obscene amounts of power in terms of just sheer command over other people. And it kind of puts them up on this almost godlike pedestal. They are untouchable in a lot of interpretations. And so when I decided to write about someone on the O5 Council being 001, I wanted to take the entire idea and kind of flip it on its head. Because to me, one of the things that I really enjoy writing and I really enjoy seeing is more human characters trying to deal with the problems that the Foundation has to deal with. So I said, okay, we have our hook in terms of site lore. We have 05-13 is anomalous. That's where we're going to start this from. And we're going to build this into, what if the O5 Council was just people? They're not gods. They're not eldritch beings. They aren't supervillains. They're just people trying to do their best. Now, they aren't just your average Joe, for the most part, because you still have to be some degree of a leader, some degree of smart. You have to have a lot of talent in order to reach that point. But at the end of the day, I wanted to show O5 Council as just people. And the thing that I really came into this article wanting to do was demonstrate a new side of the O5 Council. And I kind of take this back to reinterpreting and saying something new about site lore, because a lot of other 001 proposals have a relatively clear message in a way. You don't 100% need a message, but this is something that you can see in a lot of them. Like Jonathan Ball's proposal, Sheaf of Papers. That one's message is, here is why we have the series system. This is why we have the series system in SCP numbering the way that we do. That's sort of its message, or like the thing that it wanted to say about the site. There is the very famous S. Andrew Swan proposal, the database, and that one wanted to say something about the site. It explicitly wanted to say, this is fiction. It came in knowing that that was what it wanted to say, and it said it very loud and very clearly. I can kind of go on with a few other examples, but the point is that 001 proposals have this very concrete idea of what they are contributing to the site that's new, what they want the readers to come away with. And that new thing is like something that is based very heavily in our common assumptions about the site, really helps an 001 kind of pop.
I really like your analysis of the way each article has something new to say about the site. What I want to turn to actually is like a couple of examples of 001 proposals that I find like aren't changing the site lore. They're not trying to reinterpret some aspect of the site lore. I'm specifically talking about Lily's proposal and Shaggy's proposal. Lily's proposal being the world bursting into flowers the day before the world ends. Shaggy's proposal being about how the sun is Apollyon. From my own perspective, I find that these still feel like 001 proposals despite being sort of dead ends in terms of lore, because they're like almost trying to stir up emotions in the extreme. Lily's proposal, Shaggy's proposal, and Dr. Mackenzie's proposal, all those articles, they have this central theme almost of like the world is just over, and this is the final calling card of that branch of lore.
So in terms of like those ones where there's not necessarily a lore expansion, at least for Lily's, I would honestly argue that that one is asking the question in some ways, what if an 001 proposal was short? Like, what does it take to make someone feel the gravitas of an 001 proposal in as few words as possible? But in terms of like content, I would say that Lily's proposal, Shaggy's proposal, and I don't remember Mackenzie's well enough to say for sure, but those two at least also kind of come and say, what if the story ended? And if so, how? And this is both of their ways of saying, this is how the story would end, in my opinion. The directions that they take that ending are pretty new. Because we see a lot of stuff about the end of the world in SCPs before. Just the sheer concept of the Foundation lore ending is not new. But the two ways in which they present its end are very unique. Because one of them is, I would say, a quiet ending, and another one is probably the most visceral way of things going up in flames. I will also, though, note that Shaggy's proposal, I love it, but to me it's a little weird because that one was first written for the 3000 contest. That one was less like Shaggy went into it saying, I'm going to write an 001 proposal. Shaggy went into it writing for the horror contest and then posted it as an 001 proposal. Now, I still think it very much deserves being in the slot, but this was probably written with a slightly different frame of mind than most 001 proposals are written.
Do you think 001 proposals always need to focus on either origins or endings? Or do you think there's room for them to flesh out Foundation lore, not just in terms of this is where the story comes from or this is how the story ends, but like this is part of the world?
Of course, I think so. Most of the examples that I had listed earlier, Sheaf of Papers, my own proposal, are two really solid examples of not an origin or an ending. Actually, Sheaf of Papers is sort of an origin. So 05-13 is definitely neither an origin nor an ending. It's very much a phase in the middle of the lore. And then you have works like The Scarlet King, which there's no origin or ending there. It is a reinterpretation and a rebuilding of the Scarlet King lore. Works like Normalcy from Wrong John Silver. K. McTerius is a record, which you could also say isn't so much a beginning or an ending. Pedantic's Fishhook is definitely neither a beginning nor an ending. There's a lot of room to build out stories that take a very fundamental facet of site lore, and you don't try to end it or begin it, but you find a way to say something new about it. Kind of coming back to my thing is that you need to make sure that it's something new about a very well ingrained part of the site as a whole. It's different when you are not trying to say something new. It's much harder for it to feel as if you have shaken things up in a way. Because that's kind of what 001 proposals, they used to be kind of known for, is that they would really shake up the way someone could view the site. As you said it before, it was an event. It was someone bringing this brand new aspect to the site. And so if you're not saying something new, then you're not going to really wow people as much if you don't have anything new to say.
I think that's a really strong takeaway, honestly. 001 proposals are defined by saying something unique. You were talking earlier about, like, you specifically approached the idea of an 001. I actually am fond of the 001 proposals that weren't, like, originally 001 proposals. Lily's, Shaggy's. Do you think that an author is better off approaching an idea with the goal of making it an 001? Or do you think it's better for an author to realize that their idea is an 001?
I think that it's hard to ideate with the idea that it's going to be an 001, but when you sit down to write it, it's helpful to have it being an 001 in mind in some ways. I do know at least one other article. The first Tanhony proposal, Dead Men, was not originally an 001, but after a certain number of edits, it just reached that scale and it had something new to say about the way that the Foundation worked. I think it really depends on what an individual's writing process is. I see a lot of people try to come up with 001 ideas. Like they sit down and you're like, okay, now I'm going to write my 001 proposal. And they don't have the idea yet. They just know that that's what they want to write is an 001. And they start coming up with ideas. When I came up with the idea for 05-13, I wasn't sitting down thinking, okay, what's my 001 proposal? It was I had the idea and then I realized that would be a good 001 proposal. But before I started drafting, I kind of knew in my head that this was going to be an 001. Like the 001 slot lets you kind of play a little bit with certain things. Like you get this expected amount of grandiose. You tend to be able to make them a little longer without losing people from the get-go. Not that you should take the 001 slot as an excuse to write something really long, or that if you have something really long, that means that it should go in the 001 slot. I just knew that when I wrote 05-13 that I would get a little bit more leeway in terms of just sheer length. I know that when I sat down to write 05-13, it was an 001, but the process of coming up with the idea, that was done without me thinking it was going to be an 001 proposal.
001 proposals are viewed with higher standards and more strict individual criteria. People are generally going to be more strict in their idea of, does this work as an 001 or not? What kind of audience preconceptions or aspects of site culture around 001 proposals do you think new authors should be aware of?
So one thing that I will say is that when you write an 001, I think that in terms of background knowledge, it's better to approach it from the assumption that your readership is going to know about the site. Like this is probably not going to be the first SCP they ever read, but they are probably not also very deeply entrenched in site lore. Writing an 001 that's about some obscure Sarkic lore is probably not going to go over very well. But if you pitch it such that you don't really need to know much about Sarkicism to go into it, people will recognize the name still, and that will work to your favor. Because, 001 proposals, just kind of by virtue of being in the slot and how they're kind of perceived, if they go big, they tend to get read by a wider swath of people than your average SCP. There's not a particular amount of reason to it, that's just kind of how it is. So when you sit down to write one, if it turns out that you're making a bunch of assumptions about this very small facet of the site, then you'll probably get pinged more for not being as accessible in an 001 proposal than, say, a regular SCP, just because of its wider reach. Still, you can assume that your audience has the base level of knowledge about the site. I say this because one thing that I kind of see from people pitching 001 ideas is that a lot of ones I see get too narrow and they kind of get lost in the weeds of their own little lore thing that they want to go for. Or they go so broad that it kind of loses all sense of texture. Because while I'm saying that you should have something new to say about the site, that doesn't always mean that your actual scale of problem needs to go super grandiose. You don't need to go gigantic in the immediate scale of the article. If you have something to say, you want to make sure that you say it in a way that's most effective. A lot of 001s have a large scale, but there are some really solid entries that don't necessarily go super huge.
Gear's proposal and Pedantic's proposal are like my two favorite examples of that, like small scale 001s with big implications.
Yeah, you can do a lot without necessarily having your scale go huge. You can also do a lot without necessarily going meta. I say this because I see a lot of 001 ideas that are like super meta and they just kind of get lost in their own attempts to connect to the real world. In general, it's actually just really hard to pull off fourth wall breaking meta in an 001 because Swan's proposal already did it phenomenally. You're going to be immediately compared to that one, and it will be super difficult to top. That's just one kind of baseline hurdle. But the other one is that if you aren't able to get people to understand what you have that's new to say in an engaging way, the thing that you have to say isn't going to carry you.
Yeah, and one thing I really love about the more complex 001s, like DJ Cactus's 4-part series or Kalinen's 001 proposal, they don't just feel like individual stories, they feel like massive works and like expansive undertakings in their own right that have like the scale of an 001 proposal while still telling a variety of interesting smaller scale stories under that 001 umbrella, knowing that the reader will be hooked all the way through. You can write a more complex piece in the 001 slot and like play around with how you are tackling the story. But like, to your experience, are there any advantages of writing in the 001 slot, so to speak? Was there anything that you think an author can take advantage of by virtue of trying to write an 001?
I think that there are a few kind of things you get to pull when you write in the 001, as in you don't need to take advantage of these things, but these are things that you have the option to take advantage of. Like you can generally take advantage of having an arbitrarily high like level of clearance without needing to fully justify it because it's 001. That's like one example. You can take advantage of I don't know if this is something to take advantage of so much as something that is kind of prevalent, at least in some of my favorite 001s, but they very much understand that this is meant for truly the most top secret of eyes. So you're not going to see a lot of redactions or expungements because if it was ever supposed to be seen by anybody, it would be seen by the people reading this document. That's another thing that people get to take advantage of. Another idea, I guess, that 001s can usually take advantage of is entirely setting your SCP in a world that looks almost nothing like the assumed world of SCP. An example of that is the new Rounderhouse proposal. It kind of just assumes that you're working in this very specific SCP lore landscape. And it doesn't take a lot of time to like justify its decisions in context of building that lore. It's just like, yeah, no, we're in this world where these are the O5 members and this is what has happened to them. Whereas in a normal SCP, people might be more taken aback at just very sudden shoving lore that there's no inkling of anywhere else on the site. People, when reading an 001, tend to be looking for new lore because that's kind of what you're expecting when you're writing an 001. There's this idea that there's something new that's being presented. So presenting people with an entirely new ideas without really needing to justify how it got there or why it got there, you can get away with much, much easier.
O1s almost feel like carte blanche for you as an author to say, this is how X can be totally different, and your audience will roll with it instead of like comparing it to existing site lore. They'll be like, this is an 001, that's why it's radically different.
Yeah. I keep coming back to things that make an 001 different from everything else. There is something that I think is very important to reiterate that an 001 has in common with other strong SCP entries. And that is that, regardless of idea, the way that it is presented is still engaging and interesting. Even if your idea in the abstract is super compelling, if it's not coming through in your writing, then it doesn't really matter. Just because your ideas are 001-esque and you think that it can stand up to what's currently there, a lot of the power that comes from the slot is due to the fact that most of the stuff there is like really well written. Even if you don't like the ideas, usually the sentences are like just at a sentence level, they're pretty well written most of the time. Again, even if you don't like the idea, the execution of those ideas are quite crisp and pretty much executed as well as you can get them.
Right. 001 proposals are like generally viewed as superlative examples of the format. But this is survivorship bias at work, right? We've both seen like a ton of 001 proposals come and go. Even like hugely popular and successful articles have like tried and failed to post 001 proposals. What are some common pitfalls of writing an 001 that you see authors, new or old, fall into?
I think the main one that I haven't, at least in some degree, covered so far kind of comes back to the extra length idea. Because while you have a little bit extra room to play with in terms of length without losing your reader because they're going to come into it trusting the 001 proposal, I still see a lot of people take that as permission to go wild in terms of length without really thinking about pacing and making sure that it still reads like it's tight. I've seen people post 10,000 word proposals or multi iteration proposals that run out of steam at about a quarter of the way through, and I'm still looking and I have 7,500 words to go, and I don't want to read that. Other 001 proposals with that much length usually get that not just because they're an 001 proposal, but because they are gripping enough that the write is worth the length.
They earned their length fairly. They weren't born into it.
Cactus didn't get to post a novel into the 001 slot because it's the 001 slot. He got to post a novel because it's a pretty well written novel.
Kirby, do you have a favorite 001 proposal?
Yeah, by far and away, my favorite is Hippo and Pepper's Ghost proposal, A Good Boy. First of all, I think it is superbly written. I think that the story it tells is fantastic. First of all, it's the only explained 001 proposal. At least it was at the time. Maybe there was a new one posted that I missed, but I'm pretty sure it's the only explained 001 proposal. So first of all, big props being able to pull that off. And second of all, the anomaly is pretty much just machine learning, and it makes a lot of usage of generated text and all of that jazz, which is something that I love seeing. So I think that its new thing to say was, what if 001 was explained? How would that happen, and what would that look like? That was kind of its new thing. And then it did it in very stylish fashion. It very much reeks of both of these authors. I do not think anyone else could have written this. It feels very much in the style of both Hippo and Pepper's Ghost.
I'm a big fan of A Good Boy, and I'm especially fond of the underappreciated articles that it drew a little bit more attention to. For my money, my favorite 001 proposal is Swan's proposal. It's my favorite meta article, but I love it because it's a really unique kind of character study. It's a look into the Foundation as an entity, and it's not just that the Foundation knows they're fictional, it's that they have a plan to kill their masters. It develops the Foundation's ideology in a much stronger way than I think a lot of other 001 proposals have. And the trait of using metafiction to advance character is something that I think a lot of meta articles have struggled with, which is why I love Swan's proposal so much. It's one of my favorite looks into the Foundation as an organization and what their ideology is. And I feel like what it says about the Foundation has been very rarely matched since.
Yeah, it took the idea of being meta, and then it didn't just stop at what if meta. It took it and it immediately pointed the finger at the audience and being like, what if this is going to affect you immediately in a very concrete and real way? And it's also the build up to the meta reveal, to the realization that everything that this is all fiction, is really well written. Even if it didn't have the stinger, I think the stinger is what makes it is what really makes it something special. But just the build up to there is really well put together for that aha moment, which is something that you don't see a lot. Usually you either see meta as a stinger, but it's not as well built up to. It doesn't feel like as much of a revelation as it does in Swan's proposal. Or it's given as a premise, and in which case the fact that it's meta is the premise and therefore not a reward. Swan's proposal then goes far enough to say, not just what if meta is its own reward, it then takes it a step further and really asks, what would the Foundation do if it knew it was fictional? And the answer is it would not go gently into that good night.
Yeah.
It doesn't just say one thing that's new. It says two things that's new in a way that really makes both things pop.
I think we can both agree that if I were going to ask an author to write an 001 proposal, or if I were going to help an author write an 001 proposal, I would first have them ask, what has no one else said yet? What is actually an idea about the Foundation that no other article has said in this way?
Not necessarily just the Foundation, I want to throw that out there, but about the site, ideas on the site. I say this because there's the Twisted Gears Cactus proposal that's not really so much about the Foundation, it's more about Church of the Broken God. There's Tufto's proposal, which has something to say about the Foundation, but really it's mostly about the Scarlet King. There's a bunch of proposals that aren't necessarily about the Foundation, but it has something new to say about the site, and that's really what's important.
Thank you for covering for me, Kirby. Do you have any final words of advice for our audience?
I guess my last piece of advice is you don't need to rush to get an 001. You don't even need to write an 001. There are plenty of really good authors who don't have an 001. If you think that you have an idea that you really want to put your stamp on, then run with it, but there's no rush. You can get to it when you get to it. It's not like the slot's going anywhere.
Yeah. Plus, it's like most people's favorite articles aren't 001s. There's nothing wrong with writing an article, I think, that has the scale of an 001 outside the 001 slot.
Right.
001 is a special number, but at the end of the day, it's still just a number.
Yep.
Well, that's about all I've got to say on the topic for now. Kirby?
That is all I have on the topic as well.
Fantastic. Kirby, thanks for offering your insight on 001 proposals. Listeners at home, thank you for tuning in to Object Class Podcast.